Hi everyone, today I'm going to be talking about how to have better political discussions. Now maybe you like talking about politics, and maybe you don't. I'm about 50-50, it really just depends on the day, who I'm talking to, the issue, etc. But whether you like talking about politics or not, it's really important that we be able to do it well. Because political issues affect our well-being in tons of different ways, which I think is obvious. So these two tips are not the most obvious ways to improve political discussion. Those are probably things like don't name call, be charitable, seek to understand before criticizing, etc. But these two are more subtle and are not as well known, so I hope that they will be helpful to you as you seek to have better and more nuanced conversations with people. So the first one is don't say we when talking about the state. So oftentimes when talking about something the government does, people say, well, we did X. Now, they probably don't mean that literally. However, it's still a bad practice for two reasons. One is it's not true. Most of the time, the people you're talking to had nothing to do with the government policy in question. I remember once I was talking with some friends about a military intervention in some U.S. government military intervention in the Middle East. And one of my friends said something like, we did some bad things over there. And what's funny about this is that the military interventions in question happened before anyone in this conversation was even born. So it's just a really clear example of how just people can say we, and it's just really not accurate at all. And I think the point generalizes to most of the time people say we talking about government things. So the second reason you shouldn't say we is it makes you less persuasive if you're talking about something bad the state has done. When you say we, it can have a very personal note that can make people feel defensive. So contrast two statements. We invaded Vietnam, or the U.S. government invaded Vietnam. Do you see the difference? The U.S. government is kind of a more abstract or remote entity than when you say we is very personal. So now I admit this point doesn't apply if you're arguing in favor of something good the state has done. Saying we can give a kind of communal sense to what you're talking about that could make it more persuasive. And if that's the case, I would still just say it's not true, so don't say it. I got this point from Murray Rothbard in his book, The Anatomy of the State. Okay, so the second suggestion to improve political dialogue is don't engage in whataboutism. So this is a phenomenon that bothered me for a long time, but I never had a precise way to think or talk about it until I recently read a passage in Michael Huemer's book, Knowledge, Reality, and Value. And this is an extended quote from his book that's really good. Whataboutism occurs when someone criticizes something bad, and you respond with, what about X? Where X is some other bad thing. Example, someone complains that the current president's proposed budget has a very high deficit. You say, what about the previous president? He had high deficits too. The reason people engage in whataboutism is that rather than being interested in practical issues about what should be done in our current situation, they instead see political discussion as a kind of tribal contest, a competition between their side and the other side, where whoever makes their side look better wins. So they don't want attention focused on any flaws in one of their side's people, e.g. a politician from their own political party. So they try to divert attention to something that's bad about someone on the other side. The problem is that this practice systematically prevents evils from being addressed. For any evil in the world, unless it's literally the worst thing in the world, one can always identify some other, even worse evil and say, what about that? For any evil done by any political leader, it will virtually always be true that some other leader from another party has sometime committed a similar evil, and also that the members of that person's party didn't do anything about it. If your response when you hear about any evil currently happening is to deflect attention to some past evil committed by another person or group, that means that evils never get addressed. Attention always gets deflected by whataboutism. The next time someone else is doing something evil, that won't be addressed either, because people will say, what about the present evil that wasn't properly addressed? So I think this is a really good point by Huemer. If you've ever had the misfortune to watch TV political debates, you'll find this is absolutely rampant. Whataboutism is absolutely rampant. It happens all the time. This quote also got me thinking about applications beyond politics. I remember when I was younger, I would talk to people about my frustrations with some other people. I'm keeping this vague. And sometimes they would say, well, what about when you do X? And X was just some bad thing that I did. Most of the time they were right. I did a ton of bad things and they were right to point them out. However, this is really just a way of changing the subject. And it really used to frustrate me because I felt like my concerns weren't being taken seriously. And I think that if you think about this phenomenon, if you use this in conversation and say, okay, well, what about X, this other thing, other bad thing, other than what the person's talking to you about? Well, they can just say, okay, well, what about Y? Or like, what about Z? What about A and B? And you're like, it can just almost go on an infinite regress, and you're never going to actually make progress in resolving or talking about the evils in question. So don't engage in whataboutism. If you found these tips helpful, please like this video and let me know what you think in the comments. If you're interested in more of my thoughts on this subject, I wrote a blog post sometime last year that gives a couple more suggestions, and I'll link it in the description. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.